Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to this special episode of British Culture Albion Never Dies, looking at the very British origins of Halloween. I'm joined by my good friend Caine. You may have heard him before as we did our deep dive into tea and our deep dive into British men's wardrobes, and we also had a shallow dive into St George's Day a little while ago. He has done a huge amount of research which he presents here, and he has a special interest in these cultural traditions. You may have seen his videos on YouTube. The channel name is Videos by Caine. He's done some great videos looking at Chinese folk religions, and he really applies that same kind of scholarly insight to here, and I really appreciate it. So please do check out those videos. There's links to them in the show notes, and we do reference one video in particular which I give a link to, called the Hungry Ghost Festival, which is a Chinese festival, not directly related but perhaps thematically related. I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hello, Caine. Thank you very much for joining me once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's been a while, right? I was actually just thinking, the last episode we did was about St. George's Day, wasn't it? Was the last one before that the Christmas one?
I think so, yeah. It's been
So this
been a
is
while.
the third in a row that we're going to be doing about a holiday. And for all of the listeners who can't stand the suspense, today's episode is about the history of Halloween.
Absolutely. So you've been looking heavily into the origins of this holiday.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really interesting one because I think almost everyone with a passing interest in British culture or the culture of the English-speaking world has a bit of an idea about the history and the development of the customs related to most of our big holidays, right? So everybody has some idea about Christmas. If you listen to our podcast episode, you have a great idea of Christmas. But yeah, everyone has some idea of Christmas. Everybody has a basic idea about Easter, even St. George's Day, which is not, as we mentioned on that podcast episode, is not particularly well celebrated holiday today. I think most people know, they know the story of George the Dragon, they know it's a patron saint's day and so on. However, in my experience, at least, of talking to people, people seem to basically know nothing about Halloween. And I could understand that if this was a really, small minority holiday that's perhaps only practiced or only celebrated by a certain group, in a certain part of the country. But this is a pretty big holiday. I would say it's certainly bigger today than St. George's Day for most people. For many younger people, I think those between the sort of age of 18 to 25, I imagine are much more likely to celebrate this than they are to celebrate Bonfire Night, which is the holiday that's coming up soon. But Bonfire Night, everyone knows the story behind Bonfire Night, right? But most people know basically nothing about Halloween. So I think it's a for whatever reason, it's a holiday which, despite being quite popular, a lot of people don't know about. So it's a good subject for a podcast, I think.
And many Brits, I believe, would associate it with the United States more than ourselves.
Yeah, 100%. In fact, I spoke to a few people over the last week that I'm going to do this podcast episode, and every one of them thought it was an American holiday. Not a single person had any knowledge of the fact that it has its origins in the British Isles. Now, look, it is not untrue to say that it's an American holiday. For the most part, the way in which Halloween is celebrated today is because of the globalization of American culture. And the reason why Halloween is so popular today in the UK is because of American culture. But it's kind of an American re-import, if you understand what I mean. We've re-imported it back to the country. It didn't originate in the US, and many of the customs that many of the ways in which it's celebrated today have their origins in much older practices of the British Isles. So yeah, I think that is very interesting that we do just think it's an American thing, even though it actually comes, from the British Isles. And I asked you actually, Thomas, you obviously have an American wife. What did she think about Halloween and its origins, or did she just not think about it at all?
Like many Americans, she felt that it was probably an influence from Mexico because of the Day of the Dead.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard that one before. I've heard Americans saying they thought that it was basically an Americanization of the Mexican holiday, Day of the Dead, which it's not. That's a completely separate holiday. Now, that's not to say that that holiday may not have influenced some of the ways in which Halloween is celebrated, particularly with putting on that traditional face paint, which you wore, right, to a Halloween.
Well, I wore the mask.
Oh, you wore the mask.
So I wore the James Bond Spectre outfit. Funnily enough, in San Diego, I was probably looking the more Mexican out of all the people on this border town.
Now, was I right in thinking, because I think you said this to me once in the past, that besides that recent experience of celebrating Halloween, the only other time you celebrated Halloween was with me when we were both young children.
Yes, I think where we were living, I think the community around you decided that, oh, we'll let the kids do trick or treat because we'd seen it on TV. So I think kind of we were kind of pioneers in our
Right.
area. I'm pretty sure it's the first year it was done.
In
Um,
that area, may well have been. Yeah, we certainly. I mean, that was despite our youthful good looks. We're not that young, and that would have been quite some time ago. So we probably were one of the pioneer groups, at least in that part of the country. Maybe, you know.
yeah, yeah, and I know that my parents had lived in Germany, where you get kind of British and American quarters and so on. So it was something that was done by the American families, not done by the British
Mm.
families, for most of the time they lived there.
Yeah, and that's another thing. We spoke about how a lot of Americans don't realize that it's a British holiday, and a lot of British people
Mm,
likewise don't realize it's a British holiday. I find a lot of young British people don't realize that in the UK, it's quite new. It's not a holiday that most people, if if you're in your 20s now, if you speak to your parents and ask them, did you celebrate Halloween, or did you even know anything about Halloween when you were younger? Depending on where you are in the country, but certainly if you're in England and the lowlands of Scotland, they'll probably say no, it wasn't celebrated
yeah.
at all. It just wasn't a thing.
And
It's
when it
really,
is celebrated, I've noticed there's a significant difference. So the Americans that I come across, especially in China, but also celebrating it in America, it's not a scary thing. It's a costume party. It could be superheroes. It could be childhood. It's almost like a literary festival we have here in Yorkshire, where the children dress up as their literary heroes. It's more like that. Whereas in the UK, it's very much the Frankenstein, the vampire, the scary creatures. We seem to be lagging behind America in that respect.
yeah, it is interesting. I would say that today the holidays are celebrated almost identically. You
Mm,
wouldn't notice much of a difference at a Halloween party in the UK or the US, besides the accents, I suppose. But one of the big differences is that in a British Halloween party, everyone or almost everyone will be wearing something scary.
yeah.
Whereas in the US, you're right, there's a diversity of costumes. There often is scary. Plenty of people do dress up in scary stuff, but there's also likewise plenty of people just wearing superhero costumes and stuff.
Just to add in one more country to the mix, because I know this is a very different issue, but in China, like where I lived in Shenzhen, is kind of open to the world in some respects. So they did start to import Halloween to a point, especially young people. But what they imported was perhaps the scariest ones, to the point where the metro would refuse young people to get in because they were dressed as horror creatures.
Right, yeah, that's quite funny. I mean, that is perhaps an entirely different topic. Is the sort of unique, um, I don't know what you'd call it, cynicized Western culture. I'm not sure, but yeah,
Mm,
Halloween has been one of those ones that has been imported into China because it's fun, basically, right? It's
yeah.
fun for kids. That's the main reason why. But of course, it's taken on a quite unique, modern um, Chinese form, which is quite different than what you'd see elsewhere in the world. Oh,
Absolutely.
one thing before we go on, just a point of language. In the US, it's called a costume party, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the UK, we call it fancy dress. I also believe Irish people call it fancy dress. I'm not sure about Australians. Perhaps any Australian listener can get back to us on that. But I know Canadians and people from the US call it a costume party. But yeah, just to make your US listeners aware, if I say fancy dress, I'm referring to what they would call a costume party. This did actually cause a bit of an issue once. It was early in my time in China, and I was organizing a Halloween party mostly for other expats from places like the US and the UK. And I said it was going to be a fancy dress party. And it wasn't until very close to the party, the date of the party, that I realized that some of the Americans were intending to come in like bow ties and a suit, because they thought fancy dress meant dress in a way that is fancy, right? Like a
Yeah, and
tuxedo
it's
or something
logical,
like that.
right? Fancy.
Yeah, yeah, it
He
makes
looks
sense.
fancy.
But actually, no, in British English, fancy dress means a costume party. And it doesn't specifically mean a Halloween costume party. You could have a fancy dress party at any time of the year. It just means
Mm,
wearing a costume. Yeah.
okay.
So just keep that in mind. Another thing that I like to bring up before we begin is a disclaimer. Throughout this podcast, I'm going to be referring to Ireland and Irish people and Irish culture, and I can already imagine people getting ready to angrily type on their keyboards, Caine, Ireland is not the UK, Irish people aren't British. Don't worry, listeners. I am fully aware that the Republic of Ireland is a completely separate and distinct country from the United Kingdom. I know that British and Irish culture are different. I know that Irish people are not British, save for those perhaps a dual nationality or something. That is not the reason why I'm discussing them in this podcast about British culture. The reason is, firstly, I'm going to be talking about things which predate by many centuries the existence of the nation states of Ireland and the United Kingdom, and predate again by many centuries the existence of British national identity and Irish national identity. So, we're talking about things where it just doesn't make any sense to talk about this being a British cultural thing or an Irish cultural thing when it's 2,000 years ago. Also, for better or for worse, Ireland and the UK were united for a very long period in their history, firstly in a monarchical union and then in a political union. And yes, of course, Irish and British culture is different, but there are, in fact, many more similarities between Irish and British culture than there are differences. And, finally, I remember in one of your podcast episodes, you spoke about why did you choose to call the podcast Albion Never Dies rather than just something like, the UK Never Dies or something like that. And you made the point that you wanted it to be British culture in the very broadest possible sense, which would include, the cultures of countries which have been influenced by the UK, so places like Canada and so on and so forth, and also the British Isles generally, of which Ireland is a part, right? So yeah, disclaimer out the way. When I say Irish, please don't think that I'm confusing Irish and British people, Irish and British culture. I've explained the reason why I'm going to be.
Thank you very much. And of course, if people are angry, they can email me at albiondies@gmail.com and I'll forward everything on.
Yeah, I mean, well, what's the saying about there's no such thing as bad press, right? I mean, if you want to go and spam and troll Thomas's various accounts, I'm sure he won't mind. It'll encourage the algorithm to go there. But so let's get into it then with Halloween. It's, in fact, a much older holiday, or at least its origins are far older than many people probably imagine. Like all old holidays, the exact origins aren't clear. It developed over many centuries. There's no kind of time at which we can say that, Halloween didn't exist before this time and it did exist after this time. What seems to be the oldest thing that we can say perhaps had an influence on the modern holiday of Halloween is ancient Celtic celebrations that took place at the beginning of winter. So these were mostly celebrated by the Gaels of Ireland, and the most famous of these was Samhain. Samhain, by the way, if you're listening to this, isn't spelt how it sounds. It's spelled Samhain. So if you wanted to go and Google this, make sure you use the correct spelling, because you'll be searching for ages if you try and write Samhain phonetically and you'll never find it. Samhain was a festival which, as I said, took place at the beginning of winter. And the first thing we should say about Samhain is that we actually know very little about it. I've mentioned this before on podcast episodes that we've done. Whenever you're looking at history, the history of a celebration or something like that, be really skeptical of any kind of simple explanation. Anything that says that, oh, we do this because 1,000 years ago people did that. The fact is, history is a messy, complicated thing. When you're dealing with, a very long time ago, there is often very few records, or in the case of Samhain, for example, no records from the actual, ancient history.
Perhaps it's comparable, for example, to when was the first handshake, because we have very little historical records of handshakes, because who on earth writes in a truly important document, I reached out with my right hand, he took his right hand up, and we clasped it and moved it up and down.
Yeah.
So there's no real origin that we know for sure of how long have we been doing handshakes.
Exactly. Yeah. If you look online, you'll probably come across, for example, that, the handshake was a Roman greeting to see that you didn't have a sword up your arm, and that's supposed to just, that's it, problem solved. We know how it how it began. But of course, that's really not the case, right? And it's the same when we're talking about something like this, and specifically when we're talking about Samhain and its influence on Halloween. If you look around online, you'll come across things which essentially say, the story goes like this: Halloween is a modern Christianized version of an ancient pagan festival called Samhain. Boom, problem solved, we can all go home. The reality is that, to be honest, I don't think it's possible to draw a direct line between Samhain and Halloween. I think the influence on the practice that the influence that the practices of Samhain had on the modern day celebration of Halloween are very, very little. It does seem that, the holiday that we now have may have over hundreds of years developed from a number of different things, one of which might be Samhain, right? And that's what we're going to talk about now. And as I said earlier, we don't actually know a lot about how Samhain was celebrated or exactly what Samhain was, because we're dealing with a pre-literate culture for a start, right? We're also dealing with a time when most buildings were, built out of wood. And my point is, we don't have a lot of textual or archaeological evidence. So anytime you hear that story about Samhain was the sort of original Halloween and so on and so forth, be skeptical. What we do know about Samhain is that it was celebrated at the end of winter. It may have been a harvest festival. It may have been a winter festival. There are other people who think that it may have been the Celtic New Year. So that might have been when they celebrated transitioning into another year. And importantly for its impact on the future development of Halloween, it was believed to be a point in the year when the barrier between our world and other worlds became thinner, and as such the various entities that existed in the other worlds, which would include ghosts but also things like fairies and so on, could more easily come through into our world and interact with the world of the living and so on. And so you can start to see there where this might turn into this idea that we have today of Halloween with ghosts and ghouls and so on and so forth. It seems that at Samhain, there would be big political meetings. It may have been a time of the year when different, tribal and clan leaders would get together to discuss things. There would be drinking and feasting. There may also be contests, games. We see this in other similar events that are held in other parts of the world, right? Although this isn't certain, but there may have also been bonfires taking place. These may have been ritual or ceremonial bonfires. I find that one quite interesting because it does seem that the people of the British Isles have used bonfires as a way to celebrate many different things. I mean, the holiday that's coming up shortly after Halloween is bonfire night, right? When, of course, it's called bonfire night, we have a bonfire. Now, again, we think of bonfire night now is just okay, well, we celebrate the bonfire, maybe it's related to blowing up the Houses of Parliament. But if you actually look into the history of the reason we have bonfires, people sort of spontaneously lit them in celebration. It doesn't seem that they were making that connection of it being because Parliament was going to be blown up. It seemed that bonfires were already used as a way of celebrating, so it was natural to build bonfires to celebrate this new event. We also see bonfires used on the 12th, which is a celebration by the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. They like bonfires. So, it may well be the case that bonfires have long been used for whatever reason by the people of the British Isles as a way to mark important events. And that might go back to things such as Samhain. So Samhain spread from Ireland to Scotland. It was spread by a group of Irish people known as the Scoti or the Scoti. So a part of, to go off a mini tangent here, a part of the history of the British Isles, which is often not spoke about, is the fact that people from Ireland actually invaded and colonized part of Great Britain. The original inhabitants of what is today Scotland were the Picts. They were displaced and their culture was supplanted and their language was supplanted by Gaelic, which was brought over by invading tribes from Ireland. Yeah, but that's one that we don't seem to remember very often. But the reason we call it Scotland today is because it's the land of the Scoti, right? I'm not exactly sure what the pronunciation would be. In the same way that England is the land of the Angles, which was the Germanic tribe which invaded. And that's why we see this celebration, Samhain and other sort of winter festivals appearing in Ireland and appearing in northern Scotland, but we don't see them appearing elsewhere in mainland Great Britain because the Scoti didn't make it that far. Basically, they only made it to Scotland. Now, I'm being hesitant about discussing how this celebration was marked, and the reason is because today there has been a movement towards Celtic Reconstructionism, and we have a lot of like neo-pagan religions and so on and so forth. And many neo-pagans, particularly Celtic Reconstructionists, celebrate Samhain as a religious festival. Now, because it's celebrated that way today, people often just automatically assume that that's how it was celebrated in the past. So when you research Samhain, you'll find a lot of information which is related really to the modern celebration of Samhain. And it's not clear that much of that modern celebration is actually in any way linked to the historical celebration. In fact, it may well not have been a religious event. It may have been not exactly secular because the concept of secularism didn't exist back then, but it may not have had overtly religious undertones. In fact, the only historic documentary evidence of it being a pagan religious festival comes from a work by Geoffrey Keating, which was written in the 1600s, which is long after Samhain would have been celebrated, routinely by people, because this is well after the British Isles have been Christianized. And also in that work, he doesn't cite any of his sources. So it doesn't mean he necessarily made it up. Maybe he just didn't happen to mention where he'd found the information. But my point is that I don't want to dwell too much on its religious significance, because it just doesn't seem like there's a great deal of evidence to suggest to be either for or against the fact that it was a religious celebration. What we can say is it was a celebration that took place at the beginning of winter. It was very important to the people of Ireland and then later the people of northern Scotland. It was a time when it was believed that the barrier between our world and the other world would become thinner, and therefore spirits, fairies, and other kinds of entities would be able to roam amongst us. We know about that mostly through Irish mythology. There's a lot of old stories that are set around Samhain. But besides that, I don't think we can really say a great deal about this holiday. So again, its impact on the modern day celebration of Halloween, perhaps not as much as is often stated, but nevertheless, what we do see is modern Halloween celebrations develop in Ireland and develop in northern Scotland. That doesn't seem like it's just a coincidence. It seems to be that there was obviously these modern celebrations have their roots in much older Irish and Scottish traditions, which probably go back to these sort of celebrations, like Samhain. And there may have been other similar celebrations taking place at this time of the year.
Okay.
So getting on now to Halloween, and the first thing we should talk about is the word. And some people listening to this probably already know where the word comes from, but for those who don't, the word is a contraction. It's a contraction of All Hallows Eve. That's because it is celebrated on the evening before All Hallows Day. All Hallows Day is just an older term for All Saints Day, which is still a very important celebration day in the Catholic Church and also in the Anglican Communion and many other churches around the world. All Saints Day, as the name suggests, is the day which Christians are supposed to venerate and pray to all saints, right? Also often all martyrs. And All Saints Day is followed by All Souls Day. All Souls Day is a Catholic day of worship. Again, it's marked in other churches as well. And it's a day to pray for the recently deceased. So, of course, in Catholic theology, it's believed that when somebody dies, they don't go immediately to heaven or hell. They go to purgatory first, and you can speed up their movement through purgatory by praying to them. So we have All Saints Day to pray to and venerate saints, followed by All Souls Day. And the evening before that is basically All Saints Eve or All Hallows Eve, and these 3 days together are called Hallowmass, or sometimes All Hallowtide. So All Hallows Eve is contracted to make the word Halloween, which is how we refer to the holiday today.
Thank you very much. And just kind of to press home the significance of that, I knew a Church of England canon who went to spend, I think, a week or 2 weeks at a Catholic monastery in Ireland, and was told, very strictly, we only drink on saints' days.
Right. So every day.
every day.
Yeah.
So it just kind of impresses when you celebrate all of them in one day.
That must be a lot of drinking. Yeah, that must be a big celebration. Yeah, so the celebrating of special days on the evening before it is actually quite a common practice in Christendom, in Europe. This survives today. For example, in Germany, many of the Christmas celebrations are done on Christmas Eve, right? We spoke about this in the podcast we did on the Christmas episode. Likewise, we see now in the secular celebration of New Year, we celebrate on New Year's Eve, not New Year's Day. So the idea of having a celebration before an important festival day, having it on the evening, is quite normal. It's something that is often done. The idea of celebrating All Saints on one day, having an All Saints Day, is quite old. In fact, it's recorded as early as the 4th century that different churches would have All Saints Days. The thing is, though, there was no fixed date on which to do it. It wasn't set. And it seems that most churches actually did it usually around springtime. That's when they would have been having their All Saints Day. It seems that from the 800s, there is evidence of churches in Ireland and Northumbria, and the Kingdom of Northumbria is today northern England and lowland Scotland, I believe. I'm not 100% on the geography there, but nevertheless, it's the north part close to Scotland. And yeah, from the 800s onwards, there is evidence that churches were celebrating All Saints Day on the 1st of November, which would make Halloween the 31st of October, as it is today. And again, that gives more weight to the idea that these older Irish pagan pre-Christian ideas were influencing the Christian holiday, right? Because why would it be the Irish churches as opposed to the Spanish churches, which were choosing to celebrate All Saints Day on the 1st of November, making Halloween the 31st? However, it was in fact in the Frankish Empire, which went on to become the Holy Roman Empire, right? It was the Frankish Empire that first fixed the date of All Saints Day and thus Halloween, and that was in 835. So again, if we're going to make the argument that this is purely the result of older pre-Christian Irish traditions, then why would it be that it was the Frankish Empire that was the first to fix the date of this on the 1st of November, right? I mean, we maybe don't need to dwell on it too much, because of course it's highly likely that in the Frankish Empire, there would have also been pre-Christian traditions, which probably had celebrations at that time of the year, and there may have been a desire to, bring them in to the liturgical calendar so that people would start celebrating them in a Christian way. I mean, it's like I said, it's confusing when you look into history, right, and try and figure out how these things really began. It was around the 1100s when All Hallows Day became an official holy day of obligation, which is one of the most important days in the church calendar. And it still is today, and it was fixed for November the 1st. And so ever since that, Halloween has been celebrated on the 31st of October. So we can sort of say that's not the beginning of Halloween, because like I said, the origins go back before then, but that's when we can really sort of start to think of 31st of October is this special celebration day where we celebrate, before All Saints Day and before All Souls Day. But obviously at that time, most of the modern ways in which we celebrate Halloween wouldn't be a thing. I don't think you could go back to the 1100s and see people doing the kinds of things that we see today. Nobody would be watching horror films, for example. So I want to look now at the development of the most common things that we associate with Halloween. And of course, I think the most famous one for everybody is trick or treat, right? You'll probably remember, certainly from China, that if somebody knows anything about Halloween, it's trick or treat.
Yes, it is the Sweetie Festival.
Yeah, around this time of the year, you'd have children just running up to you, no costume, it might not even be Halloween Day, just running up to you and saying trick or treat, as if it's some sort of incantation which makes you spew sweets upon them,
And it has me in my mind of, do not accept sweet from strangers, do not accept sweet from strangers. Suddenly on this one day of the year, go to every stranger and get a sweet.
Yeah, and ask them, to get sweets. So it's certainly an interesting thing, right? And it seems quite odd now, but I actually think when we put it into the context of other holidays celebrated by the people of the British Isles, I don't think it's that unusual. So we spoke, for example, during the St. George's Day podcast about mumming and mummers plays, which are plays where people would dress up in costume. Of course, in St. George's Day, they would dress up as George and the Dragon, and they would reenact, the famous scene from the myth. But on top of that, you also had mummers plays at Christmas time. The earliest recorded evidence of a mummers play comes from 1296, which was at Christmas Day, and it was during the marriage of Edward I's daughter. There's a written record of there being mummers in the court, and there also being fiddlers and minstrels. On top of that, we spoke as well in the episode we did about Christmas about the development of caroling, right? Going to your neighbor's home, usually somebody who was more well off than you, it might be your landlord, etc., and singing a song in return for some money or a bit of food. Now, the reason why I mentioned those is not to say that they had a direct impact on trick-or-treating, but just to make sure people are aware that if you put it into the context of the way in which British people, Irish people would celebrate holidays, the idea of dressing up and going to your neighbor's house to get something isn't that unusual, right? Yeah. It was, we still have this today. Caroling, of course, is one example, but also penny for the guy, right? Going around to a neighbor's house and asking for a penny for the effigy that you've made. So it's not that unusual to think of, at this important celebration time of the year, poorer people might go to their richer neighbors and ask for some food or some money. People might want to dress up. It's not that unusual when you put it into the broader context of British holidays.
Yeah, and with the West Midlands, for example, we have the Morris dancers. It's been in the news headlines, some of their traditions, which are designed to hide their identity as they went to their rich neighbours to perform and to beg.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the fact that this tradition would also develop around Halloween, All Hallowtide, is, I don't think, particularly unusual. It seems that the most direct kind of influence on the modern tradition of trick-or-treating is a Scottish tradition called guising. Guising is short for disguising, as in wearing a disguise. And the earliest accounts of this come from the 16th century. That doesn't mean that it began in the 16th century. It may be older. It's just that's when the first records exist. And basically, it's what it sounds like. People would dress up in disguises. They would go to their neighbor's house. They might, they might sing songs, they might say rhymes and so on, and they would expect something in return. This did happen in other parts of mainland Great Britain, but really not so much outside of the Highlands of Scotland. It was more popular in Ireland, again, because of those two cultures, history, right? They came from the same people. Interestingly, there is a story actually in a journal from 1855, which talks about a man in Southern Ireland who dressed up as a white horse and led a load of young people around the town, reciting rhymes and poems in exchange for food. The reason why I find that one interesting in particular is because the white horse is a really important thing, a really important symbol perhaps in Irish mythology. And in fact, the old Gaelic god of death, the old pagan god of death in Irish culture, is called Don, and he's said to ride a white horse. So that might be evidence of how those pre-Christian ideas were continuing to influence this modern, ostensibly Christian celebration, right?
Mm.
Now, playing tricks, which is part of trick or treat, that's what the trick means. I mean, I've heard trick or treat described once as a juvenile extortion racket, which I thought was a great way of doing it, right? Either give me a treat or I will cause some problems to you. That seems to be quite a modern creation. It doesn't seem like there's many records of that having been the case, in former times. However, there are records of certain instances in Scotland where young people would become rowdy and cause problems if they weren't welcomed at people's homes. And again, we have to imagine what this might have been like. There almost certainly was drinking involved, right? You get a lot of young people together wearing disguises. When you wear a disguise, you are less inhibited because people don't know who you are. Maybe you've had a few beers. It's not hard to imagine that then resulting in people playing pranks, doing tricks, causing trouble to those who don't welcome them and give them, food and so on, right?
It is indeed a British festival.
Exactly, yeah. So although it doesn't seem that the actual, explicit trick or treat is that old, nevertheless, you can see how it would have developed from older traditions.
And when we celebrated together as children, that was something that came up of if we said trick or treat, what if somebody said trick and demanded us that we do a magic trick for them?
Was that during the party, the celebration that you and I had when we were children?
Yes, when we were kids. And it stays in my mind, there was a household who said, okay, you do a magic trick, then I'll give you a treat.
Did we?
A new one. We'd had to practice. I think a few of us had to practice various magic tricks, which, they're children's magic tricks. They were not brilliant. But nonetheless, we had to work to get the sweets.
That's
at
great.
least from one household.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Just for the benefit of the listeners, Thomas has an incredible memory of our childhood, of his childhood. I don't. Most of my memories from that period are very, blurry at best. Yeah, he often reminds me of things which I've completely forgotten. I didn't remember that, but I can certainly imagine it happening.
Yeah, it's a really interesting understanding of it, isn't it? I mean, as I say, it was the first time it was done in the neighborhood. So to have someone thinking, no, they have to work for their
if
treat.
you trick or treat, fine, give me the trick. That was something I remember explaining to Chinese people when I used to teach about this holiday as a teacher in China, is that the term trick or treat, it has a meaning. It's not just a random, set of syllables that get you sweets. And somebody could ask you for a trick, right? But also I think here trick or treat means as well that if you don't give me a treat, I will play a trick on you.
A word on that, because it did always remind me when the Chinese had this, it's how cultures collide, right? Of when I was new in China, and I think we had Chinese New Year coming up, and so I was sent along to a senior manager by a friend and told to recite a certain phrase, Gong Xi Fa Chai, Hong Bao Na Lai.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Sure. Like, Happy New Year, give me money.
Yeah. Did he?
The funny thing was, the senior manager immediately named the person. Was it her who sent you? Did she teach you that phrase?
Yeah.
But it's my incantation for money.
Yeah, so an incantation for money. I like that. But yeah, so as I was saying, it doesn't seem that playing tricks on people was a really integral part of the older version of this, which is guising, but nevertheless, you can certainly imagine how it would have developed. Now, another thing which likely perhaps contributed to the modern custom of trick or treat is souling, which is in fact quite a bit older, or at least the recorded evidence of it goes back further than guising. Souling, though, is a bit more similar to what we might consider to be sort of more traditional begging. Basically, poorer people would go to the houses of more affluent people, and they would ask for soul cakes. Soul cakes, despite being called cakes, are actually more like biscuits. They apparently have the consistency of shortbread. I've never tried them myself. They sound pretty good. Shortbread is great, by the way. If you are listening to this and you haven't tried shortbread, do try some. We can maybe do an episode one time about British biscuits, because I think that's something that is worth covering.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, back to the point. So richer people would make these soul cakes, which they would distribute as alms essentially to the poor. But in order for the poor to get them, they'd have to go to the houses of the richer people and, ask for them. This may also include singing or saying some sort of poem. And this is something that was common across the UK, not only in the communities that would do guising, and also could trace the origins back, further to these sort of pre-Christian traditions. It's also, or similar customs, not the same ones, but similar customs also exist elsewhere in Europe. Again, it's hard for us to imagine today, because we thankfully live in a world of so much abundance that the idea of having to knock on your neighbor's house to ask for food just seems absurd. But there was a point in history not that long ago where many, many people struggled to get food. So at times of celebration, you could try to sort of play on the Christian idea of charity and get your neighbors who have a bit more than you to give something to you. And that's why this is common. And we see this again, not just at Halloween, we see it at other festivals as well. Like I said, this was common across the UK. In fact, it's even mentioned in the Shakespeare play, The Two Gentlemen of Verona. So there's a scene in that play where the character Speed is saying that he knows that Valentine is in love. And Valentine asks, well, how do you know that I'm in love? And Speed starts to list all these things that he's doing that make him know that he's in love, right? So you're speaking this way, you're acting this way. And one of the things he says is, you're pulling like a beggar at Hallowmass. And so this is obviously a reference to somebody begging for things at Hallowmass. Apparently this is one of the ways in which Valentine is behaving, which indicates that he's in love. But the interesting thing is that it was so popular that Shakespeare could reference it and be confident that his audience would know exactly what he meant.
Absolutely. And just a word on the giving of alms is why we often have pubs called, the Shrewsbury Arms, which is normally spelt like
like
A-R-M-S.
yeah.
But yeah, the giving of alms. We have an alms house, I guess comparable to food banks now, but at the time, of course, it's smaller communities where people connect on a more individual level rather than kind of removed organizations and charities.
Yeah. I mean, the fact is we just don't have so much of that kind of stuff. Because we've just progressed materially so much, right, that we don't need to, which again is absolutely brilliant. I wouldn't want to live in a world where those kinds of things happen, but nevertheless it did happen, and it still does, of course, sadly happen in many countries around the world, where people routinely have to go to their neighbor or the local community and ask for food. Interestingly, this as I say, you won't see this today. I've never heard of anybody turning up at anybody's house asking for a soul cake. However, I did come across an article written in 2001 claiming that this still continues in parts of Sheffield, of all places. I'm not sure why that's strange to me, but I don't know. I always imagine this kind of stuff, when it does continue, it continues in like rural Cornwall or somewhere. Do you know what I mean? You don't imagine it. Sheffield, for the those listening who don't know, Sheffield is a kind of a large post-industrial city. It's not the kind of place you usually associate with very old British traditions, right? So in 2001, somebody claimed that this still continued in Sheffield under the name Caking Night. It was called. I was skeptical when I heard this, so I decided to do a little bit of searching around the internet. I couldn't find much. However, I did come across a post on a Sheffield forum in 2009 where somebody posted asking, does anybody remember Caking Night? I used to really like it when I was younger. So at the very least, there was one person in 2009 who claimed they used to partake in Caking Night when they were a kid.
If ever I get to meet Sean Bean,
I will be
asking him. I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, you're closer to Sheffield than I am. I mean, if you happen to be in the area on the Halloween, just see if anybody's taking Caking Night.
I'll have to head down.
And certainly, if anybody listening to this is from or has ever lived in Sheffield, definitely write Thomas if you've got opinions on this. Whether you think it's definitely a thing that you can remember or you've heard of, or whether you think it's nonsense. Because I'd be really interested to know if Caking Night does happen. And also, I'd be interested to know why it survived in Sheffield whilst not having survived elsewhere in the UK.
Yeah.
So that seems to be the development of trick or treat. Now, the term trick or treat actually originated in Canada, and then it's spread to the rest of North America and has been imported into the UK. That's something I'm going to talk about later, is how the holiday as we know it today kind of went to the US and then came back to us here in Britain. So I'm going to leave that for the moment. But yeah, the term trick or treating is not a British term. It's an American term. However, it's used to describe a custom which has its origins in very old practices which developed in the British Isles. Now, the next most famous thing, I'm not sure if this is more famous or equally as famous as trick or treat. I'm not sure, but it's carving pumpkins, right? And what would you say?
Yeah.
More or
I'd say
less?
they're comparable.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd say
You,
especially like in English-speaking countries, they're comparable. Maybe in China, less so.
yeah, I
But
mean,
it's an animal to
obviously,
itself.
we mention China a lot because we both lived there for a long time, but it might seem strange to your listeners why we keep referring to it. But just to let anybody know who, if they're new to the podcast, Thomas and I lived and worked in China for a long time. That's why we keep mentioning it. Actually, yeah, you're right. Trick or treating is much more famous in China than carving pumpkin lanterns. Because I remember when I used to teach classes about Halloween, and I would show a pumpkin, a pre-carved pumpkin, and I'd ask, "What do you think we do with pumpkins at Halloween?" And very few people would say that we carved them. Most people would think that we ate them. They were getting confused between the Thanksgiving tradition of pumpkin pie, and they would think that we ate pumpkins at Halloween, which, to be honest, sounds more reasonable than carving them up into faces, right? But nevertheless, we don't really eat them, at least not in the British Isles. I'm not sure if Americans also eat pumpkins at Halloween time. Do you know?
I shall await my inbox
Yeah, and
and
see.
see what responses I get.
So yeah, I guess trick or treating is more famous, but nevertheless, pumpkin carving, extremely famous. Now, the carving of vegetables seems to be an extremely ancient tradition, and it exists across the world in very diverse, unrelated cultures. So keep that in mind, that there's no way we could say the first carved pumpkin, like the first handshake. It's far too old. However, the practice of carving a face, particularly a scary face, into a vegetable for Halloween seems to be quite recent. I couldn't find any sort of references that go back to before the 18th century. So it seems to be a relatively new thing that it is done at Halloween. Like I said, we're talking here of traditions that would have been done by people anyway, and they're then just taking that tradition and attaching it to Halloween. So I'm not trying to claim it was invented in the 18th century or anything like that, but this tradition of pumpkin carving was a relatively more modern event. Another interesting thing is the term jack-o'-lantern. This is not used even today by people in the UK for the most part. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, we know what it is. We know what a jack-o'-lantern is because, of course, we've watched American films and all that kind of stuff. But we never refer to these things as jack-o'-lanterns. We, in my memory at least, we just call them pumpkins, don't we?
Yeah, a carved pumpkin. I know the term from a video game, and that's that.
Right, yeah.
That's how I got this term.
I mean, in fact, it became a bit difficult when I was teaching this in China and I was trying to teach the British term, because we often don't even say carved pumpkin or pumpkin lantern. We just say pumpkin. And that can be confusing because, of course, there are actually two different things. There is a pumpkin and then there is a pumpkin lantern, and they're quite different, right? But we just call them all pumpkins. And I think the reason for this is because the term jack-o'-lantern is an Irish term. And, of course, Irish migrants took it to the US, and, that hasn't gotten to us, right? So the term jack-o'-lantern, it means Jack of the Lantern. So again, it's just a contraction. And it seems to be the result of an Irish folk tale. Now, it's hard to exactly know. It is possible that the folk tale may have been slightly rewritten to make it, appropriate and make it match with the custom. Again, these things are difficult. The first written evidence of this folk tale seems to be relatively recent, but it may be a much older folk tale. There are different versions of this tale. But I'll give you the one which is, more or less generally accepted is the most common one. It contains all the main facts. So basically, there was a guy called Jack in Ireland, and he was famous for being a drunk and also just generally not a nice guy. He was, sneaky. He cheated people and so on and so forth. And the devil became interested in him because, of course, that's the kind of people that the devil is interested in. So one day Jack is walking around and he's had a few beers and he meets the devil, and the devil says, "Jack, you're a bad guy. You've done all these sins. So I'm here to take your soul down to hell." And Jack negotiates with the devil and he says, "Okay, look, fair enough. But before I go, can I just have one last beer?" Satan says, okay, fine. So they go to a pub. He orders a beer. He drinks it. Jack says, well, I've got no money. Can you pay for the beer? Satan, of course, doesn't have any money. He doesn't generally carry cash. That's not his thing. So Jack, being a smart guy, convinces Satan to turn himself into a silver coin to pay the bartender. And then once the bartender has taken the coin, Satan can just turn himself back into Satan, and then everything will be fine. Satan, not the smartest guy, I suppose, turns himself into silver coin. Jack takes the silver coin, puts it into his pocket, and in his pocket he has a crucifix. Of course, this is very uncomfortable for Satan. Satan can't turn himself back into himself, and he has to negotiate with Jack. And Jack says, well, look, I'll tell you what, give me 10 years, right? Don't come for my soul for 10 years, and I'll let you turn back into your normal form. Satan agrees, turns back. 10 years later, the time comes around. Satan comes again. Okay, Jack, it's time to take your soul. Jack says, fair enough, but I'm really hungry. Can I have as my final meal an apple? Satan obviously didn't learn his lesson the first time round, agrees to climb up a tree and grab an apple for Jack to have. As he climbs up the tree, Jack uses sticks to make crucifixes and puts them around the bottom of the tree, and so Satan is stuck up the tree. Satan again has to negotiate for how he can get off the tree, and Jack this time says, well, I'll let you off the tree if you agree to never ever take my soul to hell. Satan says, okay, fine, that's done. Of course, Jack, like all of us, has to eventually die. Perhaps his liver gets destroyed from all the booze, I'm not sure. But anyway, he dies, he goes up to heaven. But of course, God is not going to take him because he's a glutton and a sinner and all sorts of stuff. And God says, no, you've got to go to hell. You're not welcome here. He goes to hell, and he has to enter into hell as his final, place that he needs to stay. But Satan says, well, no, I'm going to make good on my bargain, and I'm never taking your soul. So as a result, he can't get into heaven and he can't get into hell, and he's forced to roam the earth as a ghost. And apparently Satan gave him an ember, a flame to light his way, which he put into some sort of lantern, and is walking around carrying this lantern, and he's called Jack of the Lantern. And thus the story goes that that's why people carve lanterns in sort of, inspired by his story, I suppose.
I love it. I've never heard that story before. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting story. I mean, again, it's one of those where, is it a case of art imitating life? In the same way that Dickens is A Christmas Carol, it impacted a lot on the way that Halloween was celebrated. Is it life imitating art? Who knows? But the fact is, that is an old Irish folktale, which has obviously had some impact on this tradition of carving pumpkin lanterns. Another interesting thing, by the way, is that pumpkins, of course, aren't native to the British Isles. They're a New World vegetable, right? So traditionally, the people of Ireland, and also in Scotland, where this practice took place, would have used swedes, which we call turnips, right? I don't know if you ever tried to carve a swede. I actually have, because interestingly enough, in certain parts of China, when I first went there, right, which was quite some time ago, it wasn't that easy to get pumpkins because, again, they're not from China. They're not part of traditional Chinese cuisine, although there are some nice Chinese pumpkin dishes. And just as a result, it's not that easy. If you go down to a normal vegetable market, you probably won't see pumpkins, especially in a smaller town, which is where I was when I first came there. And we had a big celebration for Halloween, and so we did manage to get some pumpkins, but we also got swedes, watermelons. We had a lot of children carving watermelons, which I thought was brilliant. But it's really, really, really hard to carve a swede. So if you want to sort of celebrate in a more quote unquote traditional way, do some swede carving, but be warned, you're going to need a really good solid knife because it takes a lot of work. Also, if you go online and you Google image search carved turnip, carved swede, I actually think they're a lot more scary than the modern ones. Have you seen the pictures?
I absolutely agree. I've seen the pictures, and they are the stuff of nightmares, some of them.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps because it is so difficult to carve them, right? They become kind of uncanny, because whereas the new pumpkins often look very much like faces, the old ones fall into that uncanny valley region where it's like too odd because you can't really carve the eyes properly and the mouth isn't straight,
I think with the turnips, you mentioned how difficult it is. I know. It's so difficult. I think they're getting their frustration and their anger out by creating the most hideous faces.
Yeah, maybe that's why. Like, I'm going to make this really ugly. So, okay, that takes us to the next step, which is how did all of these kinds of traditions, some of them with pre-Christian origins and so on, how did that develop into what we see today, which is Halloween parties where everyone dresses up and watching horror films and all that kind of stuff. And this is where the story shifts. It shifts over to North America. So what happens, as I'm sure pretty much everybody listening will know, is that in the 18th and 19th century, there were successive waves of immigrants from Ireland and also from the Highlands of Scotland who went over to what is, went over to the US and went over to Canada. And they took those traditions with them. Now, the really interesting thing was that for the longest time, Halloween was still very much only celebrated by those communities. So if you were from an English Protestant family, for example, if you were a French or descendant of a French immigrant, you wouldn't have celebrated Halloween. It wasn't, at least not in this way. So you may have celebrated, if you were French, for example, because you might have been Catholic, you may have celebrated Halloween, but you wouldn't have celebrated it in the way that we think of today as celebrating Halloween, right? So for a long time, it was still just limited to those communities, as it had been in the British Isles. It wasn't until the very late 19th century, early 20th century, that it actually started to spread to other communities and begin to be celebrated by all of those in North America, as it is today. Of course, it's celebrated by all of the different communities that exist in that place. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about how that all happened and the development of all these things, because firstly, it's a story in and of itself. It could get its own podcast episode. And also, this is not a podcast about American culture. It's a podcast about British culture. But suffice it to say, all of the kind of modern traditions that we have of Halloween, whilst they were inspired by these older Irish and Northern Scottish traditions, they really became their own in the US, and the modern way in which we celebrate Halloween certainly can be said to be a sort of American creation, an American creation inspired by older traditions, but an American creation nonetheless. The interesting thing is, why is it now in the UK that we celebrate it? We essentially celebrate what can at least in some way be described as an American holiday, right? And this is something, as I said at the beginning of this podcast episode, that a lot of people don't know. It is quite a new thing. If you are in your 20s now, you've grown up with Halloween, speak to your parents or speak to anybody over the age of about 40, and especially if they're almost certainly if they're from England, if they're from the lowlands of Scotland, they're from Wales, they'll probably tell you that Halloween, they might have known about it, they might have known the name, but it just wasn't a thing. Nobody celebrated it, right? And that's because, as I said, this was limited to certain communities, even within the UK. The inhabitants of Northern Scotland aren't numerically a great deal of people, are they? The vast majority of people live in the lowlands and live in England and live in Wales and so forth. So it was limited to those communities, and it wasn't what we see today, which is the sort of American style of Halloween. And basically, it was re-imported as a result of the globalization of American culture. There's an interesting thing which I actually learned from speaking to a friend of mine just last night, actually. So he's a bit older than we are, and he says that, of course, when he was a kid, Halloween wasn't a thing, but he remembers when it became a thing, and he says it was following the film E.T. So, as I think most people who are listening to this have probably watched the film E.T., there's a scene in that where they're celebrating Halloween, they're going trick-or-treating, they dress up E.T. as a ghost. He says he remembers E.T., of course, was huge in the UK, as it was in most of the English-speaking world, and he thinks that it was following Halloween that he started to see, following E.T., that he started to see more people celebrating Halloween because of the impact that film had. Of course, it's this huge, massively important part of the pop culture of the English-speaking world, right? And he sort of puts that as the date when it was re-imported into the UK. Of course, I mean, I don't know. It would take too much research for me to try to figure that one out, but I think it's an interesting theory.
But it fits with me because my family remember it kind of not being a thing and then coming back to the UK and it being a thing. And E.T. was released when my family lived abroad.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the fact is it was re-imported and it was pop culture that did it. So, it's as good a reason as any.
Is it too much to call it a Franken festival?
A Franken festival, because the mix. I would like to call it a British-American co-production. That's what I would like to call it. Yeah, a bit like the polo shirt. If anybody wants to go back and listen to our episode we did about the history of British menswear, I mentioned that I wasn't going to talk about the polo shirt because it wasn't exclusively British. It's a sort of British-American co-production. I would say that Halloween is the same. We started it off, Americans took it and they turned it into, the thing that we know today, and then we re-imported it.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think on another deep dive, I think it was the Christmas one, we were talking about how, you go back to the ancient world, you don't have the same level of standardization. So although we're talking about origins being, say, from Ireland or from here or there, you know, what it might have been in what is now Cork and what it might have been in what is now Dublin could have been radically different because we didn't have that homogeneity.
Yeah, I mean, again, to go back to Samhain and why I didn't dwell on it too much, even though if you do some research into Halloween, you'll often hear it mentioned, because we just don't know. We talk about Samhain as if it was one thing, right? It's
Mm.
almost certainly would have been celebrated in very different ways depending on what part of Ireland you were from, and what your local traditions were. I mean, this was something actually which I found uh, very apparent in my studies of Chinese folk culture, which is, my
Mm.
other big interest, my other big cultural interest, right? Um, in China, a lot of people have ideas about traditional Chinese culture or Chinese folk culture, which you'll actually realize are not necessarily or almost certainly not universal. What they represent is your experience of a folk culture in one part of China. So, the way in which a certain festival is celebrated in Fuzhou could be, extremely different to how it's celebrated in, somewhere in Shandong or something like that. And likewise, there are festivals that only exist in certain towns and provinces and don't exist in others. The dates, even of big festivals like Shaonian, Little New Year, there's a different date in
Mm.
southern China to northern China. So it would have certainly been the same in the ancient British Isles. These winter festivals that we refer to as Samhain, there may have been groups that called them a different thing. There may have been groups that celebrated them. We talked about whether or not it was a religious celebration. Maybe for some groups it was very overtly religious and contained, various religious ceremonies. And for other groups it was just what we would today call a secular celebration festival. So we don't really know, which is one of the reasons why I didn't focus on it so much. Whereas today, of course, we do have this great standardization. And
Mm.
there's pros and cons to that, right? Variety is the spice of life. It can be a little bit sad that celebrating Halloween in somewhere in the UK is almost identical to how you celebrate it in the US, but there are also benefits to that, right? We can easily understand others' cultures and easily integrate into cultural practices of different English speaking countries.
Absolutely. And just to go back a bit, I mean, I've asked you onto so many of these deep dives to talk about festivals, but if people want to find you, your channel Videos by Caine does highlight some really interesting festivals in China.
Yeah, if you are interested in this sort of thing, definitely, shameless plug from me, definitely check out my YouTube channel, which is just Videos by Caine. I actually have a video on there about the Chinese Hungry Ghost Festival, which isn't really in any way like Halloween, but at the very least, it's a festival which, marks what is believed to be a point in the year when the barrier between the worlds is thinner, much as
Mm.
Samhain did, and so on and so forth. So yeah, if you are interested in that kind of thing, do check me out. As for how Halloween is celebrated in the UK today, and if there are any differences with how it's celebrated elsewhere in the English speaking world, I don't think there is a great deal of difference. One thing that you pointed out earlier is the focus on it being about scary things.
Mm.
Like I said, it's still quite uncommon in the UK to go to a Halloween party and see someone wearing a costume that isn't scary, or at least not supposed to be scary. Another thing that I've often thought was quite unique about the way we celebrate it in the UK, but I don't actually know, and I'd like to appeal to your listeners in North America to get back in touch with you and let us know, is bobbing for apples. So bobbing for apples is something that, I definitely used to do when I was a child at Halloween parties. It's very simple. You basically fill up a bucket with water, and then you put some apples in it, and you have to try and grab the apples only using your teeth. Of course, it's very difficult because the apples sink into the water. It's just a fun thing to do for kids, or at least that's what we do today. That actually has very, 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 very ancient origins.
But can I cut in here? Because
Yes, sir.
it fascinates me. We tend to think of apples and pears as being apple shaped and pear shaped, but obviously not all pears are what we think of as pear shaped, right? Some are apple shaped. The big difference is that apples generally float and that pears generally sink. So if someone invites you to go bobbing for pears,
So no, I didn't know that. That's an interesting bit of trivia. I really didn't know that. Yeah, that's really interesting. But so bobbing for apples, though, not bobbing for pears, yeah, is actually a very ancient tradition, and one that may well have been done, in these pre-Christian celebrations such as Samhain. And originally, it was a form of divination. I'm not exactly sure how it would have worked. There's different theories, but a lot of people, or a lot of the textual evidence suggests that it was a way of trying to figure out who your future spouse might be, or at what time you might get married. We're talking about a time here when people, were very much the immaterial world was part of their life, and they very much believed in fate, and that, you know, that spirits had an influence and so on. So the idea of divining wasn't an unusual thing for them. But yeah, there was something about it would allow you to try to figure out who you were going to get married to. There may have been other reasons or other things that people were trying to work out, but it was a form of divination. And that is one which, like I said, has very, very ancient origins and has continued all the way through to today. And I know still in the UK, bobbing for apples is a very common thing, but I don't think it's popular in North America. However, I haven't looked into it that much. So I would really I really ask that any North American listeners, if you're from Canada or the US, please get in touch with Thomas on his social media accounts or email. Just let us know, is bobbing for apples a common, popular thing?
Yeah,
Is it
because
something
I
that's
didn't
done or
come
not?
across it on the West Coast, but I have many friends on social media on the East Coast and, of course, Canada as well. And I know the traditions are really different. So,
Yeah, I mean,
please let me know.
and the thing is, of course, on the East Coast of America, that's where most of the Irish settlers ended up, right? So this was an ancient tradition practiced in Ireland. So it would be strange if they didn't bring that one over. But nevertheless, when I've spoke to Americans about Halloween, I've not heard them mention bobbing for apples ever. So, don't know.
Whereas you and I did. Again, I have a clear memory of this
I do
party.
remember
We
that. I
did
do
do
remember
bobbing
bobbing
for
for
apples.
apples. Yeah. Did we also do the one where you then try to get a sweet out of flour? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. So this is
yes.
not traditional, but it's something that people sometimes do today. Whereas basically, after you've got the apple and your face is obviously soaking wet from the water, you then have to try and get a piece of candy, North Americans would say, from a big bowl of flour. So obviously, you just get flour stuck all over your face, right? That's it. You just get really gross, especially if you're wearing face paint because it's a Halloween party. It's pretty gross when you think about it now. I'm not sure in the sort of post-COVID world, many people would be happy with this practice, you know, all sharing a bucket of water than a load of flour. But I don't know. It was a more innocent time back then, wasn't it? So,
Yeah, we had a cake with candles and we all blew on it, and then everyone
exactly.
ate it.
Crazy. Yeah. So there you go, listeners. I hope that you have enjoyed that, and I hope that you are now a bit more informed. This wasn't as deep a dive perhaps as some of ours, but yeah, hopefully you know a little bit now. And please do get in touch with Thomas to answer some of the questions that I've asked, because I would like to know. And I think that, you know, there's a limit to what you can research yourself, I think, if you're outside of a situation. So I feel like there's only so much I can learn about American culture without actually speaking to Americans. So if you can get back in touch with Thomas and let him know. If you are interested in hearing more of my voice, do check out my YouTube channel, Videos by Caine, where you'll find all sorts of videos about Chinese culture, if that's your thing.
Absolutely, and I highly recommend them, and I know I've recommended them before, especially looking at these different folk religions and different aspects of culture, which, again, is why I keep asking Caine to come on again and again, because there's nobody better.
Well, thank you very much.
Sorry, let me rephrase that. Nobody does it better, because that's the way Bond phrased it.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and I hope to be on to the next one. Although I'm not sure what festival we could do next. I feel like we've covered most of them now, haven't we?
We'll have to keep discovering festivals, especially because there are so many folk festivals here in the UK.
Yeah.
And you did mention Cornwall.
Full of it down there, right?
Yes, absolutely. So again, for listeners outside the UK, that's the bit that sticks out at the bottom. But for quite a lot of our history, going quite late into the medieval era, there was a forest which kind of cut it off from the rest of the UK. So it was actually a lot more disconnected than it may look on the map. And quite frequently, it was cut off. There was only one main road going through it. So it does have
where
very different
when the Angles invaded, they didn't quite get to those periphery areas. So that's where you often see evidence of the pre-Anglicized culture of the UK.
Possibly inspiration for J.R. Tolkien's Mirkwood.
Oh, really?
Because there's that one road that goes through it, and of course it's from the West Midlands, so it's kind of close enough to provide that kind of inspiration. And there's the people of Mirkwood, and that kind of may have influenced. Sorry, because there are people who lived in that forest who had a very strange and interesting reputation, which I feel we still get in English humour. The people of Cornwall.
Perhaps unfairly, but then again, I think the Cornish do have a strong sense of their local identity, and they probably enjoy the fact that they're sometimes seen as somewhat different from the rest of England.
Absolutely.
A subject for another podcast, I'm sure.
Okay. And perhaps if somebody else knows a festival that they'd like us to cover, they can email me as well. So that's albionneverdies@gmail.com, or on Instagram, Fleming Never Dies. But again, the real one to check out is your YouTube channel, Videos by Caine.
That's Caine, by the way, for anybody listening.
Cool. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for sharing all your research.
Okay, happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.